Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, as an educator, I tend to first start with definitions. And the important definition that we need to come to an agreement on in our discussions of addressing this issue is actually, what is anti-Blackness? 7 years ago, or about 8 years ago, online, there was even the discussion and dismissal of anti-Blackness as a concept to be explored. And some of that pushback were from some Palestinian organizers who were actually questioning that. And this was like really before the kind of uprising, the movement for Black lives. And so I think while they were well-intentioned, they're kind of questioning, right, of anti-Blackness as a theoretical construct. And even their questions around and doubt and skepticism of what many African scholars and African activists have talked about, like of Afro-pessimism. It was kind of ill-informed, kind of questioning as far as for the movement. So I wanted to kind of make sure that we come to some clear understanding of what anti-Blackness is at its at its simplest level. And this clear definition says that anti-Blackness is resistance or antagonistic towards Black people, or their values or objectives, right? So just understanding that anti-Blackness can simply be resistance to Black people pursuing their objectives for liberation, right? For their autonomy. So that's important for us to understand. It could be questioning values, belief structures of Black people. Now, recognizing Black people, we also have to understand that anti-Blackness can be flattening Black people, of not understanding the diversity, the plurality of what does it mean to be a person of African descent and the multitude of experiences. But there are some shared experiences that Black people do experience, whether they are Afro-Arabs, when they live in places like Morocco or Egypt or Kuwait, but there are some shared experiences of anti-Blackness regardless of their ethnic identity or origin. Anti-Blackness, some scholars talk about anti-Blackness as a way of seeing that Black people are unacceptable human beings, regardless of their accomplishments, regardless of what they achieve in life or contribute to society. Now, this is something that we have to really think about, is like in our own community. How does anti-Blackness manifest? And if we're going to address the anti-Blackness in society, we as Muslims, and this even includes Black Muslims, must do the kind of work ourselves to uproot anti-Blackness that we've internalized and that we've justified. And honestly, as a historian, we have to look at this going back 1400 years, when Muslim societies had violated Islamic principles of equality. That there were times in Muslim societies where they actually saw other Muslims who were Black and saw them as unacceptable human beings and acceptable for enslavement. One case study is in 17th century Morocco, where the Sultan Moulay Ismail, he actually took every Black person who could not prove themselves to be free, enslaved them and forced them into his slave army. Right, so I had visited those dungeons in Meknès. And what it did do was taking the indigenous Moroccans there who were from the oasis and made them other, because they were part of his oppressive regime. And so they associated Blackness with the oppressor, who was really Moulay Ismail. Right, but Morocco has much more subtle, nuanced forms of identity, but we're here in the United States. Another point in history, we talk about our pride, right, in African resistance against slavery. That includes the Bahia revolt in Brazil. And it's a very, we need to really understand that history, but there's also other deep history. Has anybody read about the Zanj Rebellion? Anybody know about the Zanj Rebellion? So that is something we need to understand, our own history, right? So anti-Blackness is when we're devaluing a people. That's when we make a people without a history. That was what the core of what Europeans did, was making Black people without a history, without identity, and that made them unacceptable human beings. And as Muslims, we need to recognize the history of Africans and the role that Africans have played in, one, upholding Islam, right? The first hijrah was where? Abyssinia, right? So the first Muslims, like Islam was always in Africa, but yet how much of East African history do we know? How much do we know about the history of West African Muslims or in the Sahara, right? So these are like the rich history. And even today, when we think about the demographics, as we challenge the notion of who Muslims are globally, there are demographics that are saying that by 2050, that sub-Saharan Africans will outpace Arab Muslims in demographics. We know that Indonesia is the largest Muslim population, so Islam is a very Asian religion demographically, but it's also very African. And given the large populations of Nubians and Haratines in Morocco, that you're just as likely to be Black as you are to be Arab, and that there's people that have those overlapping identities. There's not a distinction necessarily between Blackness and Arabness. And so if we are going to understand ourselves as Muslim people, we're going to have to understand Black history. Okay, so that's the first thing that we could do to uproot and challenge anti-Blackness, not just within our own communities, but as we're educating others. Because when we're saying what our place is in America, we're going to the deep roots, right? The first Muslims in the United States were the Moors, right? Like some of those were the explorers, but they were also the enslaved Africans. About 20% of the Africans who were brought on the transatlantic slave trade were Muslim, and they were literate. You had scholars, you had royalty, you had people of all different ethnicities that were there and brought into the slave trade. And if we're going to claim, right, that heritage, we need to understand that deep, rich history. So that, one, we can talk about it with nuance, but we can also feel like we are truly part of that legacy, and we're not instrumentalizing Blackness as a way to say we legitimately, Muslims have always been here, we legitimately belong, but we embrace Africans and those of African descent as part of our ummah, as a fully acceptable human beings. So that's the first part that we have to do, and it's really easy to do. We have that as part of our tradition. Muslim Americans, as the most racially diverse community, has been having more advanced conversations around anti-racism, around racial justice. When you compare that to other religious groups, they're not having these types of conversations, not on this level. Maybe a few progressive groups that are out there, but Muslim Americans are much more likely to understand what inequities are and to be working towards that. And because we're so diverse, right, that we have these loyalties, we have solidarity that is entrenched in our faith, that we can be a beacon of light of what could be in our communities. So we have a specific role, and you could see Muslims as part of this movement. Now, how do we understand why is there this continual anti-Blackness, right? Why do we see the oppression of Black people? One, it is not fear of Black people. People did not go and say, hey, I'm afraid of Africans, so now I'm going to go conquer them and force them to go across the oceans and force them to work. No, we have to really understand anti-Blackness and who benefited from it. Some of that work has been done, like there is a scholar, Cedric Robinson, did work on racial capitalism, and his work goes all the way back to Andalusia, where many of us, we take pride, right, in the history of the Moors in Spain, right? And that's where this kind of notion of who were acceptable human beings. The Moors were seen as racialized as Black, some swarthy, but typically, if you read Shakespeare, when they're depicting the Moor, what do they put on them? Full-on blackface, right? And so during the time when they were kind of trying to reconquer or conquer the Iberian Peninsula, that the kings had to get certain amount of permission to do certain things to human beings because it's unacceptable. Certain atrocities you have to kind of remove or disassociate yourself, to do horrible things to other human beings. That includes taking their land and colonizing them, murdering them in kind of war, and enslaving them. And so in the doctrine of discovery, which is where the Pope, he gave King Alfonso certain rights to do things. And that was like, as long as he was perpetuating war against the disbelievers, the Saracens, and the enemies of Christ, that they can take their land, they can put them in perpetual slavery, and they can do perpetual war. And the groups that they talked about were Muslims, right? So at the impetus of why many Africans were brought along in that was that they had to sail across, right? So I'm just doing a little historical lesson, because a lot of times we see it as an offset, right? We don't see this kind of historical moment of seeing like how Muslims were always part of this story of anti-Blackness in Europe, right? And a lot of times we see it as two separate things. It was anti-Turk and anti-Black, so it's very important for us to understand that. Now, anti-Blackness, it's also important for us to understand that at that moment in the global order was the foundations of today's global order of global white supremacy. That still operates now, that decides who's acceptable as human beings, and every other nation state is sort of riding on the social ladder, trying to achieve what European nation states did achieve, right? Which is some aspects of domination and nationalism. And we know like hyper-nationalism is a scourge. Asabia is a scourge in communities. So in that foundation of our global order is founded, and the Americas founded on settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, and perpetual war. So this perpetual war, we have $1 trillion industry in the United States, right, that is just militarized, the military complex, selling weapons, $1 million bombs. And we know like when racial justice organizers, when they're looking at this, they're looking at who is getting attacked, right? These are Black and brown people. And in settler colonialism, there are still Native American people fighting for their autonomy. Anti-Blackness is at the fulcrum of white supremacy. And you could see that in this global society, whether it's capitalism, where at the time of the transatlantic slave trade, you had the foundations of capitalism where not only were Black bodies trafficked, but there was insurance policies on Black people. And that was the foundations, the trade of people to sugar, to rum, and sending raw resources back to Europe is the foundations of the inequities that we see now. That without that system, you would not have had the same genocide against Native Americans, nor could they have funded the kind of wars that built up later. Now, America is the main inheritor of that European order. And what we have now is an opportunity to right many of those wrongs. And that is by not saying, hey, we want to be part of this whole system, but looking at how slavery in every generation morphs itself. And that includes criminalization. So when the slaves were freed, what did they do? They started to make it criminal for any Black person to not work. They brought many of those same Black people back into mines and plantations. And some of those plantations exist still today. So when we're looking at the overcriminalization of Black people, and you're thinking about the millions of people who are working free, even like if you look at the recent tornadoes, was it the tornadoes, where there were prison labor, people could not even leave, and they lost their lives. They were working in factories, and they lost their lives in factories because they were like working on parole. So it's important for us to actually see, because there was a time that slavery was acceptable. And right now, mass incarceration is acceptable. And for many generations before we had smartphones, that the murder of Black people was acceptable. Yesterday, Linda Sarsour, she had said when Mike Brown was killed, there were Muslims on her social media said, well, what did he do? That was the common question within the Muslim community. Well, what did he do to deserve to be shot? Now, what I saw, like doing research on Sharia courts, right, in northern Nigeria, was that life, you could not violate the sanctity of life for any object or anything, right? So in those cases, if somebody broke into your home and took objects and the homeowner killed them, so it was like the homeowner was in the capital court case for murder, because objects are not more important than people's lives. And so it's really important that we start to dig deep into our own religious values and understand that the police officer is not the judge, jury, and executioner in any moment. And we should not have to see a man killed 1,000 times before we say that man was murdered and stand up, right? Because that's what happened with George Floyd. We should begin to question, right, many of those police reports which said, oh yeah, like he just died on his own. He had a heart attack. So many cases, but the only cases we tend to win, right, even with Dante Wright, is when there's video. We have to begin to believe the victims and question power, because when you see that over and over again, that there's something wrong in the system, and the system was meant to devalue Black lives, to criminalize Black lives. And it's not just with the police brutality, but it's with the system that continues to criminalize Black people, Black communities. It's where the patrols are. If you look in suburbs, there's just the same amount of crime in recreational drug use, in people like youth stealing things, but yet when you have constant patrolling of Black and Latino communities, guess what? You're gonna have much more arrests. And you know what they do to justify those arrests? They say, well, we got more arrests. You see, there's lots of crime. And so it's this kind of cycle where they're pulling people in. And it doesn't matter if you're Black and you live in the suburbs. You can move from inner city neighborhoods. My brother was constantly pulled over by police. And that's when I had that whole awareness of things. So much of my story has been informed by over-policing. And, but even if I wasn't, it is so important for us to take a stand. It's incumbent upon us as Muslims to take a stand for justice, even if it's against our own kin. And even if we're feeling vulnerable as a minority group, as a religious minority, there's something very powerful when you have visible Muslims. Our imams need to be at actions. Our imams need to be at the vigils and praying and making dua for this country to right wrongs. We need to see more Muslim sisters at these actions. There's something powerful in our dua for the oppressed. So I'm inviting you all to take a stand, one, and let us all uproot how we've internalized anti-Blackness. And as we work towards addressing it as us as individuals, let us continue to work on addressing that in our institutions, and our institutions to begin to stand up so that we can transform the society and make it one where we can all be welcome, safe, and have dignity. Thank you.